Good morning, viewers. Welcome to Frankly Speaking with Vibhuti. As always, we talk about issues that affect Indians all over the world. New York to New Delhi, India to United States. And we discuss the implications of the issues that affect us, both sides of the aisle. Today, I'm going to talk about Indian economy, which is never a dull story. There is always something happening. India has been on the path of liberalization ever since 1991. And as one of the people who led that initiative in this country, it is a matter of joy and frustration, agony and ecstasies as we deal with Indian economy going forward. A lot has happened. India has grown. However, there is always one question. India is always a land of massive opportunities, just as United States is. But what happens to India is worrisome on the other side of the aisle, where people say that yes, things are happening, but they are not happening at the same speed that it must. But what I do know is that ever since 2014, India's economic march has been rather substantial, with significant structural reforms introduced by Prime Minister Modi. You might agree or disagree with that notion, what has happened or what has not happened. But one cannot deny that India has today become the fourth largest economy in the world. The indexes and indices of doing business with India has improved. The confidence of investors has improved. Of late, of course, there has been a major impact on currency fluctuations, as well as the stock market meltdown for a variety of reasons. To discuss all these issues, we have two very learned people in our panel today. I have great joy in welcoming Varsha Bhattacharya. She is with Nishith, Desai and Associates, and she is an international tax expert. So welcome, Varsha, and I will look forward to hearing from you the vexing issue of taxation in India, which is never easy. Alongside, I have great pleasure in welcoming my friend, Madhu Vuppuluri. He is the president and CEO of Essar, United States, but both of them are here in their individual capacities. So do not hold them responsible for the comments they make as a corporate statement. They are here to share their individual thoughts and the implications of what they believe ought to happen or what is happening. So opening the door on that, let's look at it from this point of view. What is the Indian economic scenario right now? A lot of things are happening. One of the vexing issues in India is the sudden change in the banking world that has happened. It is not easy to conceptualize everything in a short 1 hour discussion, but we will definitely dwell upon it in later part of the day. But at this point in time, I will solicit opinions and views from Madhu regarding the corporate responsibility and how the private sector, the large corporates in India, are welcoming and responding to the various initiatives and steps taken by the Modi government to revitalize into the message of Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. Madhu, your thoughts?
Thanks, Vibhuti. Thanks for having me on the show. Clearly, of course, as you mentioned, India is a complex story in somewhat, in different facets of the growth, especially since the post-liberalization era of 1992. When you talk about 2014, of course, we should probably look a little beyond 2014. There has been significant amount of progress, especially on the industrial sector, which has taken place for past 20 odd years. But much more acceleration we have seen in the last few years, largely, of course, because of a system which has been created, which is much more responsive. I'm talking about whether the governmental systems which are created at the federal level or even the state level. We are seeing a significant encouragement to the industry for particularly manufacturing sector, which has taken place. But you would also recognize one aspect, Vibhuti. In India, the total economy, which is about $3 trillion, is dominated by services sector. Services sector contributes almost 55% of the Indian economy. and about 17-18% still is the agriculture sector. I think there's still a long way for the industry, the manufacturing sector to go forward. Unlike in other countries, particularly comparison would be China, where it's significantly much ahead in terms of manufacturing. India is still a long way to go there. But I'm very encouraged. We are living in a very exciting times, both in India as well as, of course, watching it from distance from United States, the type of opportunity India has created in a very stable government environment post 2014.
Thank you. The other part that I would like to talk with you about that is that what is happening to the Indian tax reforms? I mean, Nishith Desai Associates is a major entity in the business laws and business taxes. And so the point which always happens when I have attended many of Nishith's programs is that it almost seems the tax rules in India are almost insurmountable, unless and until you have a real inside track. Now look at it this way. More than 100 countries, they already had GST. We had a multi-layered taxation policy. Nobody knew where the tax was collected, what revenues were collected. Sales tax was a gimmick in the sense that people used to pay taxes, don't pay taxes. If you pay in cash, you don't pay sales tax. If you collected sales tax, you didn't give it to the government of India. So revenue and tax went alongside. So how would you say, Varsha, that the element of GST in the short run has caused massive disruptions? At the same time, how much it will help in the long run, and how do you think the business is responding?
So thank you for having me on this show first off. On the issue of GST in particular and the broader issue of tax reform that India has been going through, if you look back the last 3-4 years as a person practicing in this field, the regulatory landscape has changed remarkably. And of course there are a lot of challenges with the way things have been introduced, and maybe there are drafting implications and legislative issues. However, one thing that has to be noticed is that not only in GST but also in a lot of other types of tax reforms that have come in, what India is trying to do is broadly try to align itself with what are now international best practices. Even beyond India, internationally, one of the most largest international tax reforms that has happened has sort of concluded last year, the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Initiative of the OECD. And this is the single largest initiative that has happened where not only OECD countries, but also G20 nations, and for the first time including developing countries within the discussions and policy formation, that a lot of product has actually come out of this discussion, which sort of indicates where every nation is at and what everyone is thinking, to sort of align themselves and have a situation where policy is uniform and corporations, individuals no longer can take advantage of the loopholes between different regulations, and at the same time have a lot of certainty stepping into what they are. It has been a huge problem with corporations investing into India, that they don't know what the law will look like tomorrow. And the biggest example I can quote of this is the Vodafone tax.
Right.
So starting from Vodafone, tax became something which was not only a supporting sort of element of decision making within investment or restructuring of companies, but tax has become a major driving factor in actually making these decisions, how an entity will be set up, what route you will take to invest, etc. GST is yet another example of that. The world is largely moving towards a consumption tax, consumption-based tax, and India is trying to do the same. Now, of course, there will be some sort of a hurdle when you're trying to change from a really old system that we have had, which has been established, and you have jurisprudence on the extant service tax and sales tax regulations. And what you've told the industry is that we are going to do away with all of that and come into something completely new. So of course there are initial hurdles. There is a question of the kind of compliance burden it has on the industry at large. But from a bird's eye point of view, I would say that it is a move in the direction which the rest of the world is moving in, and it is probably time that India also reformed its laws to come there.
You mentioned about the best practices, international best practices. I have, personally speaking, I have a problem with that phrase, best practices. As you said very correctly, that India is a unique country. I mean, we all agree with that. It's a humongous country. Anything, if you want to implement in the Indian context, becomes a 1.3 billion problem. Nothing is easy in India to do. Therefore, should India evolve and develop its own ethos? And this dates back to one of my business trips to India when we were talking about change and transformation. I was asked by a very large major company to bring about the best practices in HR and industrial relations to be implemented in his organization in India. And I said, which best practices? The Mongolia best practice about that business, or San Francisco, US, European? What best practices do you want to imbibe? Because in that case, you don't need to do anything. You just go send your person to find out what are the best practices and bring it over. But you can't do that. The challenge of India is to develop our own ethos, because we are different. Nothing works in India just because it worked somewhere else in the world. What do you say about that, Madhu?
I totally agree with you, Vibhuti. There's no question at all. Clearly, each country has its own set of challenges, and as you rightly pointed out, the culture or ecosystem. So I would not expect India to have a solution borrowed from elsewhere, whether it is neighboring countries as close as probably Mongolia, which you have talked about, or as far as San Francisco. I totally agree that I think clearly the example can be seen. United States has not borrowed from Japan, nor Japan has borrowed from US, when both countries have probably thrived. Clearly there would have been some amount of understanding how things could be done, but each country would have evolved, their practices would have evolved based on their cultural setting as well as the historical backgrounds and so on and so forth. So clearly in India, there's a lot of fertile minds, there's a huge talent available. And one thing which I've noticed in India, which I'm sure you have noticed on all your business trips, you could definitely take certain practices which are followed elsewhere and localize them, Indianize them. I think that's an aspect which I see significantly developing in the country. That comes up with amount of extensive travel Indians in general undertake. You would not see the similar amount of overseas travel from, let's say, from United States to the rest of the world. If you look at the working population or mid-level executives, or of course the senior level guys who have by compulsion probably need to travel. But I see a much more mobile crowd, much more mobile mindset with regard to reaching out and understanding what's happening elsewhere and localizing it, or probably managing it into Indian settings. I think that's taking place beautifully.
Thank you for your observation. Really, I totally agree with you on that. What is important that you said something about Indians traveling abroad. That's a new phenomenon. It didn't happen in 1991. Indians have begun to travel. They have exchange liberalization happened. A lot of people can take more money to travel abroad. And thanks to technology, this is a very interesting element. Travel enhances your sight and vision, because you see what other people are doing, how other people are doing what they're doing. So Indians traveling abroad has created an outward tourism, and there is a need for inward tourism. We will reflect on these thoughts about innovation and other things right after this short break. Welcome back. Talking about travel. One of the things which has always interested me, because I traveled to United States in 1991, and I traveled across this country making presentations across the corporate world and individual world about investing in India. One of the things which I really what struck me was the fact that how well the domestic tourism industry had been developed in the United States. And I looked at it from the point of view that India, our country back home, has so much of historical heritages that are not protected, and there we don't have the ability to travel. And I'll give you a very simple example. One of the biggest religious tourist attractions is in my home state of Bihar, where there is Jain centers of Pavapuri, you have Buddhist thing in Bodh Gaya, but there is hardly any infrastructure that exists in those places until several years ago. The point which I'm trying to make is that if you develop tourism as a focused economic adventure, that itself has an ability to convert India's economic challenge in a far more progressive way, because you need entertainment, you need travel, you need infrastructure. So talking about international taxation perspective, taking you away from there, but as a young person from India, you have been in India until lately. So share your thoughts about how do you think, what must be done in India to ignite the domestic tourism and infrastructure that will really help the domestic economy in a big way, including international tourism?
So I think that times are changing. For one, the most important aspect here would be information. And that has been an issue in our country for a while, where the youth are not really aware of all the rich heritage that our country holds and what different parts of the country can offer. These things are changing. There are a lot of travel apps that have developed now. There are young people who are creating these companies to help people ski, to trek and discover places on their own. And so I think we are on that path where information dissemination is a major issue, and it's building up, and things are becoming better, where the young people are actually interested in seeing parts of their own country rather than have this fascination of going to the West or Europe and seeing places that are otherwise so well advertised. So definitely information, and the other thing is accessibility. Costs and accessibility.
Accessibility and cost. Now that's another part of it, which I would like to have Madhu's thought process, because remember one thing, having info is okay, but if you don't have the infrastructure to go to certain places and stay there safely and have time to spend there, then that information is no good. The point is, Madhu, what would you say about the connectivity in India, which is a very, very important thing, because India has a very unique situation. Other than traveling from Delhi to Trivandrum, which may take 3+ hours, rest of the country can be connected in 2 hours by flight, but the hinterland is not. And that's the power of airline connectivity that must happen in India. Let me share with you a very interesting data that I came across way back in 2007. And at that time, India had 100,000 rooms for traveling needs for domestic and international travelers, ranging from 1 star to 5 star. Vegas alone has had 100,000 rooms. Similarly, airline traffic. There were 6,560 odd aircrafts serving the flying needs of Americans, but there were only 350 aircrafts at that time. So if we are able to connect Belgaum, Kadapa, Motihari, or Jhanjharpur in Bihar, or any other place in Madhya Pradesh, it will have a massive backward and forward linkages impact on the economy. You have been part of airline industry at one point in time in your life. What do you think is that Indian airline industry is not growing as much as it can?
Well, I would look at it as glass half full rather than glass half empty. Like you, I have traveled extensively, Vibhuti. I have traveled globally to probably 40, 50 countries.
Right.
And in fact, recently I was in Europe, in one of European countries, in a well-known city. And and I've been there a few times in the last about 6-8 months. And every time I go there, the airport, is in such a shape. Probably what you would have noticed in India about 30 years ago is the type of airport you would still see in Europe today, in some of the prominent cities in Europe. So coming to that aspect, I think India has leapfrogged in certain ways, especially the airport infrastructure which has been built in India is really extremely impressive. You would notice the type of airports, whether it's in Mumbai, Delhi, of course, both the cities are well known and people travel there and they would have seen that. But smaller cities, smaller means relatively smaller cities, I should say, places like Hyderabad or Vizag, which is Visakhapatnam, which I have been to, and similar cities in other states of India have moved progressively to modernize and make it much more attractive for people to not only just transit through them, and I see a lot of people coming to the airports for having a place like an entertainment or a place like a...
I totally agree with you. I mean, like you have said that you have traveled many countries, and traveling to India is pleasure. When you land in Bombay, in Hyderabad, Bangalore or Delhi for that matter, it's such a pleasure to see airports of, I would put it, better than international standards. So I'm very proud of that. But my focus is on how do we develop those hinterland and what is the cost impact for do you think the private sector will operate? Do you think government subsidy is required? And because airline industry can really catapult India into a massive economic spurt.
I totally agree. First and foremost, I think airline industry can really make connectivity that much easier, that much more easier, without any doubt. And I think we should also probably acknowledge the fact that Indian railway system has extensive network and connects very remote places, extremely remote places very well. But having said that, you're right that airline would take one step forward or probably few steps forward in terms of making connectivity that much more easier. And I've seen measures and initiatives in this regard in India. Already I'm seeing that. You know that all the airports, major airports in India are through private-public partnership or even probably privately managed with certain amount of association by the government of India or state governments and so on and so forth. So I think that model is continuing. But you're absolutely right. There are places, I think, stepping back, let me mention, I think the places where it got developed is largely with reference to business connectivity, where people needed to travel. I think you are talking about people where you need to encourage people to travel is much more to do with the places like historic places or sightseeing locations so that you can develop a tourism industry around those locations, which is absolutely paramount for India to focus on. Because as Varsha rightly mentioned, of course, there is a huge, rich heritage of thousands of years old monuments and other places which could be well positioned for domestic as well as international travel. So there is huge opportunity. There is absolutely no denying of the fact. And I think I've seen some initiative in that regard, but it's still a long way to go, especially from tourism perspective or encouraging infrastructure connectivity to the popular tourist or not so popular tourist locations. I should mention one thing. I have known one of the founders of one of the largest private equity funds here in New York. I have met him several times. He has a huge fascination to travel to India around December 25th, 26th time frame, which is Christmas time frame, along with his family. And each year, he would take few of his family friends and take them to India. The places he travels are places like Hampi in Karnataka,
right.
Which I was quite surprised, and he would speak so much about it. But the way he's traveling is, he's taking his private plane and going there and visiting that place and staying there for a couple of nights and probably going to the usual circuit of travel like Jaipur, Udaipur and other places. But he definitely goes to some other places which are not reasonably or well known to individuals even living in India.
Very true. I mean, the extent of knowledge about India, that information that you talked about, is becoming like it's on your notepad, it's on your smartphone. There is no information that's not available. The point which I'm trying to make is that domestic tourism protects your ancient heritages, and that's what attracts foreigners to come and visit India if they have a good infrastructure. What I do know, I'm not going to give you statistics, but in the last 4 years, Mr. Modi has done an outstanding work in terms of developing the road connectivity and technology connectivity, so that a lot of things have happened. But going forward, what must happen? That one thing, in your opinion, must happen as a young person. You are the young millennial. What must the government do today to encourage domestic tourism? Because not everybody can go abroad. So why not encourage the domestic tourism than saying that going to Thailand or Singapore is easier and less costly than going to, say, Uti for that matter, or some place in Punjab or Assam for that matter? What is that one thing that you would, if Prime Minister were to ask you, what would you tell him to do?
Speaking from personal experience as a person who has grown up in India, I would say women's safety. That is the single biggest factor that is pulling our country down today. And it is unacceptable, the kind of things we read in the newspaper every single day. And of course, you have things that are visible on the macro level that we are developing in. But the economy, the politics are not dissociated from the social. And this is something very important to have as a given. No woman in a country should feel unsafe to go somewhere simply because we don't have a safe place to stay, or the mode of travel is not adequate, or there isn't enough security. So for me, the single biggest factor would be safety.
You have touched upon a very, very strong point of view, and women's safety and the kind of suffering or unsafe environment women face. My thought process is, it's more in North India. I don't think South India faces the kind of grave, serious safety issue for women. I'm from Bihar. Now, I'll tell you something very simple. When I came to Pune to study, Bihar was a completely different, unsafe place for women to go about. When I came to Pune to study in 1969, I was totally astounded that women were going on cycles, they were going to schools very safely, going to college on riding a bike. Women used to be going for movies, theaters, and it was a different world for me. Pune became a different world for me from where I came from. The point of the matter is that why is it an issue in North India as much as it is there? I mean, that kind of bothers me and baffles me. Your thought? I mean, it is very important because you very correctly said women's safety for travel is must. And from that point of view, why is North India so unsafe for women?
Well, I wouldn't.
I would not say unsafe. Why the incidents happen in North more than anywhere else?
Well, unfortunately, I think to begin with, I fully endorse what Varsha mentioned. I think safety of anybody, especially in a different location, is important. Of course, all the more for women. There's no question at all. I think the right climate of a safe environment needs to be created for encouraging domestic travel for individuals as well as international tourists to come into India. And we read a lot of gory stories about different parts of a country being classified a capital of something, so on and so forth, which is unfortunate. And Vibhuti, while I agree partially with you that unfortunately this stigma is largely centered around North India, but I wouldn't suggest that probably it is not there or doesn't exist, may not be in the same extent or may not have been publicized as much, but it has been taking place even in south of India. So therefore, I think it is across the country situation. People will have to be educated. In fact, I was noticing one aspect. The education, we always talk about, of course, how to educate youth, how to educate women, how to educate a young man. I'm talking purely the issue of women's safety, which Varsha brought about. I think it's trying to have a much wider education aspect brought in of responsibility towards one and other. That aspect is missing. In fact, recently we have been reading, watching about the mob lynching which is taking place on misguided WhatsApp groups being circulated in places like Karnataka, in places like Hyderabad and Assam, for people who are coming from different parts of the country. I'm not, apart from women's safety, I'm talking about if they look different, there is a suspicion that there may be something nefarious about their intent to be in the neighborhood. So all those things need to be sort of rectified in some form, shape or the other. by a proper educational system, proper awareness system which has to take place. It's a massive country with obviously lots of issues and lots of problems. But I won't classify North versus South or East versus
No,
West.
no, no. I was not talking about North versus South, but most of the incidents reported are from North. And this also bothers me personally, and I think it will anger all of you who are listening to this, is that we are a country, we are the only country, faith, religion, lifestyle system where women have goddesses stature, whether it's Lakshmi, Saraswati, Devaki, whatever it is. Despite that, it's enshrined in our belief system, we still have these incidents are allowed to happen. We'll take a short break. When we come back, we will discuss two other key issues with our panelists. So stay with us. Welcome back. What we wanted to talk about also is that manufacturing. Mr. Modi started an initiative called Make in India. Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, Make in India, manufacturing for creating jobs. Manufacturing is always the really lifeline of a country. I recall way back in 91 when NAFTA was introduced here, I had opined in our business circles that NAFTA will kill the soul of America for one reason, because the blue collar workers do not have the same ability or mobility to move or change or adapt. They had values that if they went to a factory, they worked there, they had a shift system, and the family developed. That was the American dream of its own kind. But if manufacturing goes away, it definitely affects the social fabric of the country. Now the Make in India program, the offset program for defense productions, those are very important initiatives. So what, according to you, Varsha, is the international perspective of what laws in India encourage or are still discouraging people to think again before they step into India, including the much dreaded Vodafone case. People don't know what will happen, and to that end, the bureaucracy is blamed. Do we in India have such a bloated bureaucracy that interferes in everything and everything that goes around? Your thought on that?
So, of course, there's the issue of laws changing pretty much on a daily basis. And then there are the C reforms that have happened in the last 1 or 2 years. One major move that a lot of tax reform has been angled towards is tapping the digital sector and basically imposing taxes on digital presence in India, which is something that has not happened so far in most countries in the world. So it's not like India is lagging behind in this, or it is something that we as a country are lacking. This is primarily because business as a structure has always had a territorial presence, and the concept of your traditional marketplace, which is now changing, and everything can be done remotely from a distant location. Probably an entity doesn't even need to have a presence in India to be selling goods in India. So the message is very strong and clear that that is not going to work any longer. What India has done is it's imposed an equalization levy, which is basically a tax withholding that an Indian entity has to do for any digital advertising space that a foreign entity is providing. So that's a 6% tax then and there. There are also general income tax laws have been widened, where earlier a non-resident which had a physical presence in India would be taxed, but now we have something called a significant economic presence as well, which is if you have customers or sales in India above a certain amount, then that also amounts to a physical presence in India, can be taken as a physical presence in India for taxation purposes. Then you have your GST which has come in, which is strongly manufacturing focused, because the incidence of tax now is supply as opposed to value addition and excise and everything else that we had, and service provision that we had before. So I think India is definitely coming across with a very strong statement as to the kind of activities it will support and it will encourage in India.
Thank you. Madhu, the one thing which is very important is the tax complications. Foreign companies always talk to me about this. When will you streamline the tax process? You have been with the corporate, you have been international. The one thing which I recall from my student days, that it was Pandit Nehru, who was the Prime Minister. He had given a clarion call to India, which actually that quote of his was part of many essay competitions. Nehru had said, export or perish. That was a very wonderful, powerful statement too for the Indian industry. But we forgot about that. We did not think about it. If we had indeed become an export-oriented country, it would have led to establishment of quality products. It would have led to many significant improved technology to manufacture, because if you're exporting, you have to meet the international standards. But we did not do that. Perhaps bureaucracy had a role to play. Now India is focusing on manufacturing, exports, offsets, and whatever else. So the question here is again, will we miss the bus, or this time we are going to catch the flight?
Well, clearly we have talked about missing the bus. I think we missed a little bit of the ride already. There's no question at all. Everybody knows that. In fact, I was in Shanghai a few years ago. It's about 10 years back. And one of the policymakers was giving a speech. And I was quite surprised of the content of the speech, what he mentioned. He had a slide. On the slide, he showed the extent of Chinese products or Chinese presence in terms of international trade, dating back to about 1,000 years of 1,500 years ago. I do not know whether the data was reliable or not. But he had a data point there that China had 35% of the international trade 1,500 years ago. Today it has something like 15% or 20%. I don't recollect the numbers. Something where he was saying that it has declined. He says they want to go back to their legitimate position in international trade, which existed 1,000 or 1,500 years ago. That was the vision. That's the vision with which China progressed. And I'm just talking about one individual, but that seems to have been vision of the country. So when you visit China, clearly he was saying what we have to make is, we should become the manufactory of the world. That's a word he used. China would like to be the manufactory of the world. So that remained in my head. It's almost, I think 2007 is when I visited that country. I'm talking about subsequently I visited several times, but I remember this particular speech of his or remarks of his. So clearly we have ceded that space to China. We all know that every product which we see in the United States is largely manufactured out of China, whether it's iPhones to other products which we commonly come across in various shops or merchandise. I think India need to get there in the manufacturing space. There's no denying the fact, and I think the initiative taken by the Prime Minister recently of creating this right environment and suggesting that we should become an export-oriented, as well as, of course, self-sustaining manufacturing industry in the country is important. Having said that, I think there has been, we all know the aspect. One is the talent required. The real talent required for manufacturing is not purely taught in the colleges of what you come across, whether it is bachelors of arts or sciences or commerce, or not the ones which can probably get to the finish line as far as the manufacturing is concerned. There is a lot of on-the-job training which is required. There is requirement for, in my assessment, there are 2-year courses which take place in the United States and technical courses. It has to be an associate degree, has to be created for people to have an engineering or semi-engineering or people who can get to technical fields. That needs to be created. So we are producing a lot of graduates, but clearly not employable graduates in manufacturing sector is what my gut feel is. We all know that India requires 1 million jobs a month to overcome or to cope up with the unemployment issue. So there's a huge task in front of us, very challenging task, I'm talking in front of India, to make that happen. And they have to create the right climate of, number one, creating the infrastructure for industries to be established. Number two, the connectivities to ports and so on and so forth, so that export could take place, to your earlier point. And more importantly, number three is employable sort of youth who
Right.
can be easily employed in industrials.
To that end, you are totally right about that. This is something which happened several years ago. The question had come about in 2007 in a major symposium where I was one of the speakers, is that how would India sustain at that time's 8 or 9% growth rate if it didn't have enough skilled people to do varieties of jobs in manufacturing? And to that end, Prime Minister has definitely initiated the various skill development initiatives, but we have a long way to go. Having said that, one of the things which is important to remember is that manufacturing is not an overnight thing. It requires a lot of policy changes. And if we become, we have to have the Chinese mindset for that. Chinese mindset is we do it and they move it. We have too many imponderables within our own system, too many questions, too many objections, and that's where the democratic element of business prevents us from doing something. So think about it. Bofor's scandal set us behind by 70 years in defense modernization. Now, Rafael, by the opposition cacophony of the whole thing, is again derailing India's defense preparedness and manufacturing in every single sense of the term. Talking about that again, we will dwell upon one very important issue here, energy issue. India is 81% of India's energy bill is from petroleum imports and its total dependence on that. Innovation happens when you suffer from want of something. Brooklyn in our backyard is famous for many innovative practices that catapulted US industry in more ways than one, in thinking and doing. What is lacking in India that we are not able to develop, knowing fully well that oil is a crisis element for us? We have not developed indigenous resource utilization of solar for that matter. India is solar rich. Prime Minister started the International Solar Alliance. Some trillions of dollars are going to be raised about that. But at a ground level, given the fact that energy awareness has become big, what international legal implications that India needs to overcome to encourage solar development in India, which for domestic use?
I would say that more than any legal standards that India needs to
Legal standards from the point of view, because we have to import technology.
Right.
And solar technology has developed much more elsewhere than it has developed in India.
Right.
So my question is dual. One is that development of local talent and local efficiencies. And what we can do is that if the wheel has already been invented, why do we have to reinvent the wheel? Mm-hmm. Can we borrow the technology? What are the intellectual property issues that are key to bringing technology to India for solar development? Storage of energy is also one of them. Any thought on that?
Of course. So when it comes to a question of borrowing what is already there and what has already been invented in the world at large, I think what India has been doing and has had on its law books for a while are a lot of incentives in its taxation system and even the intellectual property regime. So when it comes to the inflow of information, there are certain sectors which are incentivized with either a higher deduction under taxes or some sort of a tax rebate or something, or a government subsidy to sort of encourage this kind of industry to develop in India. As far as having our own homegrown industry grow, I would again go back to the point of education. Education, higher education, which is focused and skilled, is something that our country really needs to work on, because there are a lot of amazing educational programs in our country in different fields, but do they actually get the youth of India to a point where they can execute is a question that needs to be dwelled upon.
Thank you. The other part which I wanted to talk about, the youth and their engagement in this, how is the corporate sector responding? Because what is important here is, because I did some work on the skill development part of it, and because my interests are very varied, I will confess here. So skill matters a lot, because every time, you can be a good badminton player, but you will be a lousy tennis player. You can be a good cricket player, but you will not be able to play baseball. So these are all different elements that require different kind of skills. The corporate knows what kind of people they need. So is the corporate collaborating with the government? Because it can't always be a government initiative. It has to be what you call private joint venture between the corporate sector.
Yes.
That I need so many naval engineers, that kind of a thing. So how is the corporate world responding to that challenge?
Well, corporate world is responding fairly well, Vibhuti. I should say this because for obvious reasons. Because when they invest billions of dollars in a new technology or a new industry, and you would know that India has most of the capital formation, particularly in the assets which have been created in manufacturing, is all recent. I'm talking about last probably 20, 30 years. Unlike in the United States, which is probably, if you go to a steel plant in the United States, that will be about 120 years old. Whereas most of steel plants in India, barring Tata Steel as well as, which is again modernized significantly, or Steel Authority of India Limited steel plants, most of the other steel plants have come up in the last 20, 25 years time frame. So they have, I'm talking purely from steel plant, of course it would go across to other sectors, whether it's power sector and others. So they have gone ahead and tried to get the local employable youth trained at their location. So there's a continuous training program which is given by the steel plants, tapping into the population and talent of youth which is available for their own benefit and of course for the benefit of the community. It's taking place. Clearly the challenge is much larger. It needs to happen in much larger scale, but I'm also concerned on the creation of new assets in the country, which is, I think, had taken a setback in the last few years. I hope it will be taking a boost back to creating larger capacities, particularly aiming at exports, to your earlier point.
Thank you very much. It was a very useful day today. We discussed on so many issues. While before I close, I wanted to say that there are certain very important decisions were conveyed by Supreme Court in the last few days. One of them, which relates to the women issue, was the Supreme Court ruled that Sabrimala Temple will be open to all women, regardless of age restrictions, which is a very powerful thing to happen. You can't impose certain biological element and physiological elements for doing something or not doing something. The other important part is that role of technology. WhatsApp correspondence led to a 71% decline in the stock value of a company in just one day. So the question is, will India be able to take advantage of the technology leap, or will technology exposure inhibit India in a very different way? We will talk about these issues in my next program. Thank you very much for being with me on Frankly Speaking with Vibhuti Jha, and I hope you enjoyed the Frankly Speaking views of our panelists today. Thank you very much, Madhu, and thank you very much, Varsha, for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.